Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As has already been said, my name is Duncan Depledge. I'm a lecturer in geopolitics and security from Loughborough University, and it is an honour and a pleasure to chair this event today. I'd like to thank BESA and the BESA War Studies Working Group for helping us to organise this event despite everything that has happened over the past few months. This was something that we proposed for the conference that was mentioned, which unfortunately was cancelled. We wish, of course, that we could have met all of you in Newcastle, but I do urge that you please do follow up with us individually or as a group if there's anything you hear today that you wish to discuss further with us. We have an absolutely fantastic panel today, including 2 geographers and 2 from international relations. I see myself as sitting somewhere between the 2 disciplines, but I think the truth is that the entire panel has experience of engaging with both disciplines when it comes to the Arctic. The other characteristic that we share as a group of scholars is our experience of working at the academic policy interface. We've all had various roles as advisors to parliamentary select committees, to all-party parliamentary groups, government departments and international organisations. And I hope when we get on to questions later, we'll be able to reflect on some of those experiences as well. There are, of course, detailed biographies to be found online of all the panellists. So in the interest of time, I'm only going to give the briefest of introductions. In alphabetical order, we have Professor Klaus Dodds, a Professor of Geopolitics in the Department of Geography at Royal Holloway. Professor Caroline Kennedy-Pipe, my colleague at Loughborough University, who is a Professor of International Security and International Relations. Dr. Ingrid Medby, a Senior Lecturer in Political Geography at Oxford Brookes University. And Dr. James Rogers, an Assistant Professor in War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. Before we go into the discussion, I just want to provide you with a bit more background to this roundtable, particularly for those of you in the audience who may be relatively new to the Arctic. For anyone who's been following the news recently, you'll be aware that there's been an unprecedented heat wave in Siberia, which has seen some of the highest temperatures ever recorded in the Arctic. The latest figure that I saw was that a few days ago it reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 38 degrees Celsius in a small northern town in Siberia. And that's the furthest north that temperature has ever been recorded. Meanwhile, the National Snow and Ice Data Center in the US, which I think is a good reference point for most of us who are trying to track what's actually happening to the sea ice from month to month, has reported that at present, the Arctic sea ice is tracking below the level seen at this time of year back in 2012. 2012 was a significant year because that was the last time that we saw the sea ice extent so low, but it was also the year which had the lowest summer sea ice extent on record. And that's essentially the condition of the sea ice come September at the end of the summer season. Both of these developments are part of what many scientists are now calling a new normal for the Arctic, which has really emerged since around about 2007. Before 2007, the summer sea ice minima was never below 5 million square kilometers, but since then it has ranged somewhere between 3 and 5.1 million square kilometers. This compares to a range of about 6 to 8 million square kilometers in the 1980s and 1990s. How long this new normal is actually going to hold, though, is still in question, given that the overall trajectory is still for the sea ice minimum to be headed very much downwards, despite annual variation. And I think it's safe to say now that many scientists think that the Arctic will experience its first ice-free summer within a generation now. At the same time as all this, tensions do appear to be building in the Arctic. Just to give you some of the headlines, we know for some time now that Russia is actively building and upgrading military bases in the region. This includes many that haven't been used since the Cold War. The overall aim of this, broadly speaking, seems to be to secure control of the Northern Sea route and also discourage NATO from building up any sort of presence in the region. Meanwhile, the United States in the last few years has been repeatedly warning that it is concerned by what it calls aggressive behavior from China and Russia, and claim that this kind of activity is starting to turn the region back into an arena for power and competition, something that reportedly requires a new age of strategic engagement in the Arctic of the kind not seen since the Cold War. And China, meanwhile, is attempting to build a near-Arctic identity for itself based on expanding scientific and commercial interests in the region. To what end, still, I think, remains unclear. There are, of course, other kinds of tensions emerging too, involving state and non-state actors, such as over the right to self-determination, to autonomy and independence, and over whether the Arctic should be preserved or exploited, and if so, on whose behalf. And for some time now, though, there's been a tendency, I think, to still view the geopolitics of the Arctic through quite a simplistic lens, focusing on whether the region is one of conflict or cooperation. Cold War tensions and conflicts. During the Cold War, we saw a region which tended to be defined by tension and conflict, and this was then followed by a period of post-Cold War peace and cooperation. But neither of these ideas of Cold War conflict or even Arctic exceptionalism, which is often associated with this idea of peace in the region, neither of them seems to be a particularly good fit anymore for describing the contemporary Arctic. I think we're starting to see a shift now in the academic literature that's starting to try and produce a more nuanced view of this. So if we're not seeing a new Cold War in the region, and if we're not, I think what we can say is that what's emerging in the Arctic is something that is more layered and more complex, encompassing both great power competition and more localized struggles, involving a much more diverse array of actors from across the world. Underpinning all of this is a sense that the expansion of activity and interest in the region is very much caught up with various political struggles over how local, national, and global actors are coming to terms with, accommodating, or even rewriting their relationship with an increasingly ice-free Arctic. How we should approach all this is the issue that we're here to begin discussing today, and I very much hope that it will just be the beginning of that discussion, and we'll be able to take this dialogue forward in the months and years ahead. So to begin with, though, it's really best that we start by coming up with some agreement over what we actually mean by an ice-free Arctic. And to help us with that, I want to turn first of all to Professor Klaus Dodds. So Klaus, what do you make of this idea of an ice-free Arctic?
Thank you, Duncan, for the introduction on behalf of all of us as a panel, and obviously I extend a welcome to everyone who's participating. I think just a couple of things. First of all, I would say, when we talk about an ice-free Arctic, we can, of course, refer it as a sort of scientific technical issue. So, for example, when physical geographers and oceanographers refer to ice-free, what they're referring to is this idea that anything less than 1 million square kilometers of sea ice would constitute an ice-free Arctic. So that's a straightforward answer. We can use numbers, we can use data to approach the idea of ice-free. I'm going to suggest, however, there are three other ways of thinking about the implications of ice-free. The first is the logic of disappearance. So what does it mean for sea ice to disappear? Because one of the wondrous things about ice is it has this stunning capacity to change elementally. So it can go from vapor, solid, liquid, and have these multiple possibilities, if you will. So one is thinking about it as disappearance. The second might be about extraction. In other words, if you like, discursively thinking about taking something away. And I'm going to make a sort of parallel here with an absolutely integral feature of Arctic geopolitics, which is imagining the Arctic as Indian-free. And if you think about the history of Arctic states, particularly through things like residential schools, one of the things that connects ice and native Indian populations is often settler colonial Arctic states have been interested in extracting things, in taking things away, making the Indian less Indian, making the Arctic less ice-bound, ice-filled. You can think about all those extraordinary plans the Soviets had at one stage for using nuclear weapons to destroy sea ice. And the third thing to finish off with is we can think about ice-free also as leaving deposits. In other words, what remains. So one of the interesting things we're discovering is the ice that remains, the ice that endures, is also ending up being a little sort of micro archive. In some cases, archiving things we don't care for, such as microplastics that we're finding increasingly in the Central Arctic Ocean. So I think there are different logics and there are different ways of thinking about what ice-free might mean.
That's a really interesting way of characterizing the problem. But I wonder, why does it actually matter if the Arctic is ice-free or not? I mean, you've pointed to these ideas of disappearance and extraction and remain, but who is actually being affected by this?
So again, I think as a geographer, one of the things we tend to be interested in is the relationship between people, animals, other living beings, and environments. And I think what's so clear with the disappearance of sea ice is that it has a whole series of very delicate but sometimes profoundly obvious connections with other parts of the world. So to give you a couple of quick examples, the first is we know if you take sea ice away from the Arctic Ocean or the Southern Ocean, you then set in train profound changes to the ocean, which suddenly becomes far more exposed. It becomes open water, it warms, it acidifies, and that then has profound knock-on consequences for marine communities. It has profound consequences for indigenous peoples who have for millennia used sea ice to travel and to, of course, extract food, particularly marine mammals, again, often at the sea ice edge. It means that a space that was once considered a frozen desert can get reimagined as a kind of polar Mediterranean, as a kind of shipping lane. And then finally, it means that China can start to think of the Arctic Ocean in radically different ways than it would have done, say, in 1949. So in 2018, 2019, China will argue, as it does to this day, it is a near-Arctic state. Nobody would have argued that in 1949. So that's just a little illustration. The idea of proximity and distance and connection, as I've said before in a book in 2016, things get scrambled by these elemental changes.
I think one of the things that I'm struck by in what you're saying there is this idea of moving to an ice-free Arctic, however that's defined. It implies something of a state change is going on, and you hinted at that by talking about the Arctic as a frozen desert shifting to this kind of polar Mediterranean. And I just wonder though, in terms of ongoing variation and I guess liveliness in the Arctic ice, that even if for some years we may see, or it may become more likely that we will see ice-free summers, in other years the ice is likely still to come back. And so there's going to be almost this constant tension, if you will, between what's actually happening year to year versus what we're trying to almost impose on the Arctic as a kind of way of imagining it.
Well, I think what that emphasizes is, for one thing, how bad our two-dimensional maps are at actually making sense of this thing that we're concerned with, which is about something being ice-free. You're talking about an extraordinary dynamic environment. And also for those who haven't been to the Arctic, let alone seen the Arctic Ocean, I mean, I think it's sometimes also, you can very quickly lose sense of how big the Arctic Ocean is. It may be the world's smallest ocean, but it's still 14, 15 million square kilometers. This is big space. And what we're finding is, of course, is that, yes, there are seasonal variations in terms of sea ice extent. But where we are concerned is that what we call multi-year sea ice is becoming less prevalent. So where you can see sea ice grow again, it's often thinner ice, which makes it more prone to further melting. So what do we take away from this? Well, it should remind us yet again that the categories we often use in international relations, like territory, border, region, these are far more dynamic and contingent than perhaps scholars have often assumed in the recent past.
They say that it's far more contingent than scholars have assumed. Do you think that the same can be said for international law and the kind of governance structures that we see in the Arctic?
Well, I think, again, there's been actually tremendous interest in international law, in thinking about how law continues to make itself relevant in an era of climate change and profound territorial readjustment. To give one example that I think many participants will probably be aware of, is the classic case of the low-lying island. What happens if an island disappears, if it becomes submerged? Does the territorial sea, does the exclusive economic zone, does the extended continental shelf disappear with that piece of land, that territory? Conversely, you have in the South China Sea where China is actively rebuilding geography in order to create islands, which then they wish and have done, they inhabit, in order to generate territorial sea and exclusive economic zone. So we have in the Arctic, we have coastal communities that are being submerged or disrupted or threatened with eradication. And so we have, for example, climate change refugees as we speak in places like Alaska. And what you talked about earlier in Siberia, we also can add to that profound permafrost thawing, for example. And that's not just on the land, that's also on the subsurface. It's underwater, it's on the seabed below. So in a sense, this is also about eruption. Things in the Arctic are literally erupting as well as disappearing. So these elemental changes can't be underestimated.
Thank you, Klaus. We'll move on now to think a little bit more about who the main actors are. And for that, I would like to turn to Ingrid now. Ingrid, who do you think really decides about what matters in the Arctic and what's happening in the region and why we should, and I guess how we should be approaching the region?
Yeah, hi Duncan, hi everyone. I think fortunately there isn't any one very simple answer to who decides what matters in the Arctic. I think that's quite a complex answer to that, which is a good thing. I think before even attempting to answer that, I think it is worth mentioning that we take for granted that everyone knows what we talk about when we talk about the Arctic, but actually it is a region which has a number of different definitions. And when we talk about an ice-free Arctic, we often imagine the ocean, so the ocean spaces, right? But if we use the Arctic Circle, that also includes a lot of land, questions of, for example, permafrost thaw, and land that is very much part of the territories of sovereign states. And of course, extending from the coasts, we have the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, governing the ways in which ocean spaces are regulated as well. So in terms of who decides in the Arctic, I think it is safe to say that it is very much a region governed by states. There is the Arctic Council, which we've already heard mention of, which is an intergovernmental body made up of member states sitting around a table voting. It has uniquely also Indigenous peoples representatives as participants. And I think this is really important. And I think this is one of the things that is interesting about the Arctic as both a very traditional state-governed region, but also it has these dynamics to it that are idiosyncratic. So, for example, the fact that within the Arctic Council, even though there are state representatives sitting there and voting and making decisions, you also have Indigenous peoples representatives who are to be consulted on everything. So they do get to have a say. So I think there is still some way to go in order to be able to say that local populations and Indigenous peoples really get to decide what is in effect often their homelands. Unfortunately, I don't think that is yet the case. They do have a voice in a way that I think is increasing, and which is an example for many other international regions in the world. The other thing to say about who decides and what matters in the Arctic is, I think it is interesting in the way that actually science has a really important role in Arctic governance. So both in terms of continental shelf claims and other decisions that are made, it is very often made on the basis of scientific data. So state leaders and representatives, whether that is in the Arctic Council or other international fora, they often come with scientific data upon which they base whatever claims or decisions that they want to make. So even though scientists or analysts we can't say that we get to decide, there is a unique role there, which I think is interesting to explore further as well. Yeah.
You mentioned Arctic a lot, the word Arctic a lot in your answer there, and it's interesting to think if it's hard to define where the Arctic is, then it must also be hard to define or pin down who the Arctic actors are as such. And so, given that we've already mentioned China a couple of times and this idea of China as a near Arctic state, you've introduced the term the Arctic states. Do you think there really is such a thing as Arctic and near Arctic identity, and what kind of permanence do you attach to these things? Because, you know, Klaus mentioned that we wouldn't have thought of China as a near Arctic state 50, 60 years ago. I would venture that, you know, you might not even have thought of the Arctic states as Arctic states much before the late 80s, early 90s, and this kind of real push to sort of start developing a sort of a circumpolar view of the region. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's very true. But I think Klaus mentioned this as well beautifully, how the changes that we see in the Arctic, they don't just affect the regions that might be within the Arctic Circle, for example. So this is what my research is about. It's about Arctic identities, and I've been really fascinated by how those changing environments also change how people think of themselves, and how roles and responsibilities are shared based on who people would kind of articulate themselves to be, and their identities and their histories and their narratives. But of course, with the kinds of changes that we are seeing, many people further south are also deeply affected by the kind of physical changes that take place there. So in my doctoral research, I conducted interviews with state personnel in Norway, Canada, and Iceland. And I would highlight the example of Iceland because I find it fascinating how they spoke about their Arctic identity. So Iceland as a country is south of the Arctic Circle, just about. But when I asked them about their Arctic identity, what makes them Arctic, quite a few of them talked about how they are kind of enveloped by these oceanic currents that go to and from the Arctic. So they are touched by those water currents, and the water that comes to and from the Arctic Ocean that then makes them Arctic, and with the histories that they have in terms of fishery, for example, and other resources that they get from that coastalness or islandness, being very linked to the Arctic. But you are completely right that the term Arctic, I would say, is an externally imposed label in most cases. Many of you might know that the Arctic is a Greek term. It is not one that originates in the north. I think for very many people living north of the Arctic Circle or living in the Arctic states, they would perhaps think of themselves as northern up until very recently, but not necessarily Arctic. I think this Arctic label has come with increasing interest in the region, often from further southern lying actors. And there have been other regional kind of labels attached to very similar spaces in the past as well. And I think what many of them share is the constructedness of that regionalism. But I think it's important to say that even though these regions are constructed and they might be externally imposed, that doesn't mean that they don't have a power and importance for the people who live there as well. And so I think for many northern populations at the moment, even though they might not have a history of calling themselves Arctic, it is nevertheless a label that they can kind of take up, and it can be a platform or a way in which to become empowered and to have a voice in kind of saying that we recognize that when you talk about the Arctic, you're talking about us, and therefore we should also be heard, even though it might be a new label.
With all that in mind, then, do you anticipate, this is probably being a bit speculative, but do you anticipate other identities sort of emerging in the region in future? Could you imagine new kinds of Arctic identities emerging as we kind of see the sorts of changes we've been talking about?
Yes, identity is something that you develop in relation to others, right? So, and it's something that is always changing. Identity is not something static and that is decided once and for all, that kind of idea of selfhood. It is something that is, you hold a number of identities all at once. And so with more actors coming to the Arctic, more activities taking place, you could certainly see other ways of engaging with that space taking prominence as well. So thinking about, for example, livelihoods, if you had a tradition of a fishery, quite often people will articulate a sense of identity tied to those histories. We could imagine in the future with more kind of Arctic activities that more people might also feel that Arcticness is something that they see themselves as part of. And I think this is also where that Chinese articulation of being near Arctic is very interesting, because China has an increasing role in the Arctic, and that's economic but also scientific. There are many Chinese scientists going to the Arctic and conducting field work there. And if you spend a lot of time there, then you could imagine that they will see themselves as having a particular kind of perhaps Arctic scientist's identity, or other kinds of identities based on activities. Tourism is another one which I think is really important. I think the more often you come into contact with people from elsewhere, you think of yourself differently as well.
Thank you, Ingrid. James, I'd like to turn to you now. So far we've talked about the fact that the Arctic is becoming increasingly ice-free and how what that might mean in different ways. We've talked about the identities associated with the Arctic and the kinds of actors emerging in the region and expressing interest in the region. So given all that, and given the focus of the workshop, how realistic is the problem?
Ooh, good question. Inflammatory question. I think that war is sadly realistic, and that's not to indulge in hyperbole. We just need to look at the long history of military activity in the Arctic region, including recent activity. I found it really interesting when Klaus said about a perception of a polar Mediterranean, because you look at the Mediterranean context during the Second World War, you can see desperate attempts to cut off supply lines to Rommel's troops in North Africa and to hold on to Malta. And you look during the Second World War up into the high north and the Arctic region, and you can see similar attempts to cut off important supply lines. The different areas of the Arctic have been a vital strategic choke point for great powers. Look at the Arctic convoys and the convoys across the Atlantic to resupply our former ally Russia and to keep Britain thriving during the Second World War and keep that war effort going. Look at attempts to make sure there were communication stations on Greenland to make sure that the weather could be communicated back to the UK so that they could ensure that D-Day was set on the right day when the weather was good, and German attempts to establish their own weather stations and communication stations on Greenland. And then you move across and you start to see in different regions of the Arctic where there are desperate attempts by British forces to secure mines on Svalbard and places like that. So for me, the Arctic has long been a militarized space where war and conflict have been conducted. As we start to look towards today and we toy with this notion of ice-free, we can see that it is increasingly an important strategic choke point and a place of resource extraction for great powers. And for me, we're entering a period, a delicate balancing period, where great powers are starting to re-establish their military presence in the Arctic. And, states need to be very careful about how they tread, because you can easily trigger, once again, those old conflicts that have lied dormant.
So that would suggest that you think the Arctic is being militarized now?
Remilitarized. Again, we need to reflect back on this history and not be too over the top about this. Like you said in your introduction, Russia is re-establishing and reaffirming and rebuilding its bases that already existed, during the Second World War and through the Cold War. A major military presence that's there to help defend the Northern Sea route, but also to provide vital infrastructure that's needed to make the most of that potentially economically vibrant region for an economically stagnant Russia, that area that could be a vital bloodline for Russia. But of course, that's the defensive element. Russia also has some offensive capabilities there, and we look at, of course, Russian nuclear forces, but its longer range precision missile capabilities, its incursions of submarines into the North Atlantic, and the UK-Greenland-Iceland gap. And then you start to see a triggering of a response from the US, most notably under the Trump administration. And this recent memorandum, built off the back of a quite powerful Pompeo and a Pompeo doctrine, to ensure that the US has its icebreaker capability, but also builds at least 2 new bases outside of the territory of the United States, which we think will be in the Arctic region. And it'll be quite, well, I watch and wait to see where those bases will be placed.
It's obviously quite a traditional approach to think about military activity as base building and putting troops into the region and so on. But the kind of the broader context, I guess, at the moment, if we think about West-Russia relations or even West-China relations, is perhaps a little bit more subtle than that, a bit more nuanced than that. And we're seeing, I mentioned in my introduction about Chinese scientific and commercial activity in the Arctic. And some people look at this as being something quite innocent. Other people might call it strategic infiltration. So I'm wondering, do terms like the grey zone, hybrid warfare, all of these kind of terms which are being popularized at the moment, do they have any purchase on what we're seeing in the Arctic?
I think as I sit here in Denmark, geographically speaking, I'm British, so I can't afford a Danish point of view, but what you can say is that these terms of hybridity and grey zones do bear a resonance in the debates. There are great worries in this area that Chinese ultimatums to the Kingdom of Denmark, to the Faroe Islands, about trade deals in exchange for Holloway communication systems, about advancements into Greenland and mining and extraction through front companies. And these are major worries. These aren't, like you say, the traditional manifestations of military activity, of basings and military hardware. But they are very worrying for Arctic states. And as I've written in my work, I think it's important for NATO allies to support those Arctic states where they request and where needed, to make sure that we cooperate as a coalition to ensure that there isn't any unwanted infiltration in those regions.
That's really great, James. Thank you. Caroline, turning to you. Many of the questions that we've been discussing, they're well known, I think, in the field of Arctic studies, and I'm sure many of the members of the audience who are engaging with us today who are from that sort of specific area will have recognized that. But I wonder, what can we draw out of this? What do you think we can draw out of this as being the broader issues that these questions raise for the discipline of international relations?
So obviously I've learnt very much from Ingrid and working with Klaus. And I suppose I would take 3 major points from my geographer colleagues, which I think can inform the place of international relations in the Arctic. The first would be, I think what geography has done is really show us that the Arctic is not a place apart. We knew this during the Cold War, but during the 1990s, in that interregnum after the end of the Cold War, and Gorbachev in particular, his Murmansk speech talking about zones of peace, I think we were slightly deluded or overly optimistic about the state of international relations. And so we treated the Arctic, and Ingrid's quite right to talk about definitions here, as a place apart, a zone of harmony, which I think really culminated in the decision to create the Arctic Council, which of course doesn't have a hard security angle, indeed deliberately eschews it. So I think I've learnt that the connections between the Arctic and the rest of the globe, whether scientific, climate, ice, are intimate actually, and that what happens in the Arctic, as we all know, doesn't stay in the Arctic. So that's my first point, that IR needs not to categorize the Arctic as separate in any sense. And we know that during the 1990s, when many in IR became obsessed with globalization, there was this idea that the world would be connected, and nowhere is that more true than I think than in the Arctic. And here science and diplomacy are twinned, to come back to an earlier point. The second principle, I think, for international relations scholars is that we need to rethink some of the staples, if you like, of the Westphalian system. And in particular, to agree with Klaus, sovereignty has many different meanings, I think, in the Arctic, and the Westphalian notion of territorial integrity has to be questioned, indeed is being questioned in the Arctic. And here I think in particular we need to think, as Tim O'Reilly has pointed out from Scott Polar, really in the Arctic we talk about sovereign rights as opposed to sovereignty. Svalbard would be the obvious example where the treaty after World War I seemed to give the Norwegians sovereignty, but actually gave sovereign rights to countries like Russia. And that's strategically and politically very important today. So I'd like really in the discussion to think about those boundaries that we think of as sovereign. A third aspect is what I call the elastic, or the nature of the Arctic and the claims, as Ingrid has pointed out, upon that space. And it seems to me that many non-Arctic states are very elastic in their definitions of interest and the global commons. And indeed, if we think of the Arctic as an elastic space because of points 1 and points 2, what we see is countries like India claiming to be Arctic and interested. So in this way, the elastic nature of how we define the Arctic or the High North, I think is very pertinent for international relations scholars. And here I would again, and James is sitting in Denmark, Denmark we claim to be an Arctic state, but if we think about what's happening, let's say in Greenland, hugely contested in post-colonial politics, which speaks to a certain dimension of international relations, well, Denmark wouldn't have much purchase in the Arctic without Greenland. So I think contested spaces, which as we know is very fashionable in international relations, does have quite a lot to say. And I would also throw in here, James has talked about Russia. I think that ideology is becoming far more important than any idea of a grey zone. I mean, I think Primo Levi would be turning in his grave if he could see the way to which we've put grey zone. I mean, grey zone means a morally ambiguous place. That's the essence of a grey zone. And yet, if we look at American claims and Russian claims to the Arctic, there's nothing morally ambiguous about it. This is highly ideological in terms of what forms of governance structures should be extended into the Arctic. And so I think we need to think of contested spaces, but an ideology, and ideological struggles that are playing out, perhaps through hybrid war, but certainly through notions of the peoples, as Ingrid would have it. And here, Russia is exceptionally good at setting up mischief making or using minorities or indigenous people. And part, and James is the expert here, of course, is what we see in the Arctic, absolutely. I think is, as we see in many parts of US strategy, if I can go to strategy rather than IR, is an over-reliance on technology and a belief that technological advantages can have purchase in this vast dark space. And we need to see how that will play out. So what have I learned from my geography colleagues, and what should I learn? I think an expansion of the humanities into integration with our science and geography colleagues to understand this very different space. I mean, I think the Eastern Arctic, which is what James was predominantly talking about, is very different to the Pacific Arctic. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Caroline. Related to that, I guess, and going back to an earlier point in the introduction that I was making, I wonder how well you think we are positioned at the moment for actually engaging with policymakers and other kinds of stakeholders, whether that's environmental NGOs or indigenous groups or businesses and so on, in terms of trying to communicate some of these ideas across to them. I mean, do we have that I guess intellectual purchase yet, that we're able to actually shape how some of these stakeholders and policymakers might think about this region, or is there still a lot more work to be done, you know, back in the university before we should be trying to change things?
Well, I think even in the 1960s, people like J.H. Plum were arguing that the humanities had to engage with policymakers or become socially trivial. So this isn't a new debate. And I think the Academy, particularly with COVID-19, and again, to come back to something that Klaus said, what the Arctic has taught us is the importance of food chains and the people-animal climate nexus. And so I think with COVID-19, we're all aware of how we need to treat logistics and food chains. So I would say it's never more relevant. How we go about doing that, well, you yourself know, you know, you can move from the policy world into academia now. And I think in a post-COVID-19 world, I'm hoping that we will learn to do that better.
Thank you, Caroline. So my final question, which is for the whole panel, but I'm going to direct it to Klaus in the first instance. Klaus, you've written in the past about the emergence of a new polar geopolitics. You've more recently called for an ice humanities, and as Caroline just mentioned, expanding the humanities is clearly an important part of what needs to be done at the moment. What is it that you think, though, has been missing from the social sciences in its approach to places like the Arctic, icy places like the Arctic, I should say?
Well, I think in terms of my own trajectory, I mean, Caroline's been very, very generous in terms of talking what how geography has spoken to her as a scholar. I mean, I think I also, like all of us, I think the further you get into your career, you just keep on accumulating academic and scholarly debts. So I think a lot of my interest in ice came about because I had Dennis Cosgrove as my mentor when I first joined Royal Holloway over 25 years ago. And Dennis wrote you know, some lovely work which took very seriously environments like mountains, jungles, oceans, and part of my interest in ice was actually taking seriously that sort of humanities scholarship, which thinks not only about how communities over time and space think very differently about elemental substances like ice, water, air, and the like, but also I think to take more seriously some of the more contemporary scholarship that you find in environmental humanities, in ocean humanities, blue humanities, that looks at things like, and Caroline hinted at this, I think, is those sort of messy entanglements. You know, the idea that, for example, if we're to take seriously a space like the Arctic, it's a volume, but it's a leaky volume. It's not a two-dimensional flat space. It's incredibly dynamic. It's animated. We have to take seriously multi-species entanglements, multiple stakeholders and placeholders. So I'd make a distinction there as a sort of heuristic. But also to take up the challenge. I mean, after all, we're speaking at a moment, not only of pandemic, but also social protests, things like Black Lives Matter. Well, what does it mean to decolonize further our conceptions of spaces like the Arctic, to take seriously, for example, indigenous struggles for climate justice? Well, part of that struggle is also rooted in an acknowledgement that settler colonialism has served to make many indigenous and native communities in the Arctic precarious, way before we in the South and the West were invoking climate change as somehow destabilizing for the Arctic and beyond. So I think there are lots of things here. So my interest in ice humanities is in one sense very, very capacious, and I think reflects a lot of the reading and also the engagement and the pleasure I've had from listening to others.
Thank you, Klaus. Would anyone else from the panel like to come in on that with any final thoughts? No? Okay, well, I think it's time then to open up for questions. Our audience has been waiting very patiently, and for that I'm grateful. But if you can use the raise hand feature, and then let us know who you are and who your question is directed to. and maybe a question at some stage.
Maybe I can jump in while we wait for the audience to articulate the question. I just wanted to say, in terms of kind of what's missing, this is not something that's missing entirely, but where I really hope that some more work can take place is around how, and this is kind of repeating some of what Klaus said, but how settler colonial kind of understandings and sciences have really shaped how we think of the Arctic at all. So thinking about this, kind of having read some of Catherine Yuso's recent work on how geology and this kind of the fundamental science that we use and that we think of are based on these very colonial and also kind of capitalist structures. So what would it mean to kind of disentangle how we think of the Arctic and really going back to those definitional questions? What is it that we're talking about when we talk about the Arctic? What is it that we're including and what are we not including? And that includes the actors that we talk about when we talk about Arctic security, for example, but also in terms of the environments, as Klaus said, the non-human, the more than human, those environments that have been kind of active in shaping the Arctic also before climate change. So how does it change the way that we think about politics if we try to take these things into account, which I think is ever more important now in this era, the so-called Anthropocene.
Thank you, Ingrid. So a question there about the hand symbol. It should be that if you select if you hover at the bottom of your screen and bring up the kind of control panel and select participants, and then you can raise your hand using one of the buttons there. We have a question from Alexander Evans.
Thank you very much. So Alexander Evans, 10 Downing Street. I really interesting panel, so thank you very much. I guess my question would be about the so what for the UK in this. Clearly, there seems to be a consensus that both in climatic terms and in geopolitical terms, the Arctic's becoming more important. What do you think that means for the UK, and what should the UK be doing to respond to and anticipate that challenge?
Who would like to begin with that?
Duncan, if you would like.
James, and then Caroline.
I was actually going to say that you're Mr. UK Arctic, Duncan, so perhaps you have some words to say on this.
Well, I think this is, it's very much something that we're at the moment. And if you saw recently, there was a paper that was published out of Imperial College that essentially was trying to answer exactly that question, bringing together views from across the Arctic science and social science community. I'm always quite struck when it comes to the UK that when you talk to government about the Arctic, the point that is always underscored is that the number one priority for the UK is peace and stability in the region. But that doesn't necessarily mean being, striving to defend the region in sort of military terms, so much as also trying to avoid disturbing the region and allowing it to develop in a way that doesn't necessarily involve direct intervention from the UK. And I think what we've probably seen over the last decade or so is that is becoming harder and harder for the UK now, partly because of the geographical location, but also now that given that NATO, given that the United States are both sort of stepping up their interest in certainly in the high north and the North Atlantic areas, it makes it much more important, I guess, for the UK to be engaged through that. Caroline, did you want to come in as well?
So two features of this. The first is to express a personal opinion, think that the emphasis in the UK on the south rather than on the northern space in Arctic terms or Antarctic terms is worrying. I think that the emphasis and the I think the view that somehow the UK or the EU can foster a kind of polar code along an Antarctic treaty, I think that's really rather naive. So I would say I think the direction of travel to the south is probably misplaced in terms of the UK. My other point would be really this point about the UK is it does have a significant issue, as we know, with Russia. And I think that the Russian Arctic is very much a litmus test for the way that Mr. Putin will behave for his forever presidency, as it now seems to be. So I think not to watch Russian actions in the High North more broadly is a mistake. And I think we made that mistake in the 1990s, and it cost us quite gravely in terms of a Russian policy. So again, Russia is extremely interesting. I describe it in my work as a fragile power. But the question there is Russia more dangerous? Is it more prone to mischief making, hybrid war, whatever we want to call it, when it's fragile? We've done a lot of work on demography, on aging populations in the Russian Arctic. And the idea of remilitarization rests on a very perilous, I think, assumption about what Russia can afford. And here again, I would come back to our alliance with Norway. Svalbard is absolutely key, both to the Norwegians and to the Russians in terms of the Eastern Arctic. So I think the UK, as a member of NATO, but also as a friend to many in the High North, it has a key role to play.
Did anyone else have anything to add to that?
Could I jump in there?
Sorry, who was that?
That was myself, Patrick.
Oh, hi, Patrick.
Yeah, hi. The other thing is just to sort of tag on what Caroline said at the end there is, the relationship with Norway, which in sort of military and from an army perspective, the Navy, I suppose, really, at the moment they're talking about cutting the Royal Marines. The Royal Marines are the land capability in the Arctic that the UK has, essentially. They've got great training links and relationships with the Norwegians and other Baltic countries, so Scandinavian countries. So I would just bear in mind that as well. That cutting some of the Arctic land-based capability. Obviously, there's drones, Air Force, and Navy platforms, but it's something that does not come without a major implication for up there.
Related to that, the renewed emphasis on both the North Atlantic and the Baltic region should not be ignored in all of this. I mean, when Caroline was talking about an elastic Arctic, I think one of the things that has become increasingly clear is that what happens particularly in that high north space of the European Arctic is very much closely connected now to the Baltics and to the North Atlantic. Mm. So if you're thinking about how Britain maintains a presence in Estonia, what's the northern dimension to that? What are the potential threats coming from the north? How does the changing situation in the north actually create not necessarily a new front, but certainly brings in a new angle on that deployment?
Duncan?
Yes, Klaus.
Can I just also give an elemental answer to that question as well? So another way to think about the UK's relationship with the Arctic and the Arctic's relationship with the UK is to think about it through land, sea, ice and air. So just to pick up on ice, one of the interesting things about ice is that the UK and Norway can have a very profound military relationship on ice. And they have done so since the early 1970s when Royal Marines first went up north to receive so-called cold weather training. But of course, once you go under ice, the US and the UK have conducted submarine operations in recent times. And I think if you take each element, air would be another one. One of the reasons why we worry about Arctic air is because it has implications for the UK weather and climate. Or, for example, if we look at sea, then we can think about how the UK might well be connected increasingly to an Arctic Ocean that has vastly more shipping and commercial activity. So I think what the answers also, I think, reveal is that our relationship is multifaceted. And if you think about objects as well, if you want to trace the UK's relationship as a former Arctic state, imperial state, then just go to a whole series of museums and go and check out the artifacts that you can see. That is another near constant reminder of both a past Arctic, but also how that informs the current and future Arctic.
I hope that gives you some answer to your question, Alexander. We'll move on now to Brian Cole as the next person I have on my list.
Yes, good afternoon and good morning from here in the States. Very interesting discussion, and I've heard this a lot about the issues and concerns of security in the Arctic. But I guess my question goes to James or Caroline in particular. Is this security narrative? That this narrative is in light of this massive amount of cooperation that we've seen over the last decades with the Arctic Council and all the other regimes under the auspices of the Arctic Council and other international regimes. But we see this developing Arctic security issue that's developing as a narrative, and as this narrative becomes a self-realizing, militarization within the Arctic. I mean, we see that here in the U.S. I live here in D.C. You go to these the think tanks, and it's this constant narrative of increasing securitization and I guess maybe militarization. But it's based, but founded on what? And my concern is that if we don't have, if there's not if the policymakers don't quite understand what they're talking about in terms of why is there this securitization developing, that we end up creating policies and budgets and so on and so forth that create this securitization when really there's no particular reason, it seems, for it, if that makes any sense.
James, would you like to come in first?
There's a lot to unpack and untangle there, but for me, there is a justified narrative of security concerns and militarization, remilitarization in the Arctic. You just turn to the increased activity along the northern sea route, and you turn back to Alexander Evans' question, and thank you for that, and thank you, Brian, as well. You start to see the fact that year on year, you're getting vast percentage increases on the amount of trade activity that's moving through the northern sea route. And like Caroline says, that links the Pacific round to the Atlantic. And you start to discuss the fact that Russia is making sure that it has full multi-domain control over that region, and the number of bases that are being built there, along with 5-6 Arctic drone squadrons, its investments in next generation and future generation icebreakers, including its military corvettes. Russia's going to make sure that it can charge a toll to go through that, and if it doesn't want certain ships to move through the northern sea route, then it can certainly do so. How does this affect the UK? Back to Alexander's question. Well, we know that Russia is not averse to turning off supply lines. And so if you have a movement through the northern sea route of global supplies, such as the Venturmaersk, the Danish ship, which moved with South Korean electronics, Russian fish, from Vladivostok round to St. Petersburg, then you can start to see how, if that route is preferred then to Suez, then the UK's supply lines, its economic security, and that of Europe, well, could indeed be jeopardized by this shift from, like Caroline said, the south to the north. And therefore, I think the UK should start to look seriously at that shift in security terms, Brian, up towards the north.
Thank you, James. Caroline, did you have anything to add?
I think that this is a really interesting theory, and thank you, Brian, because studying Russia, one could see, and Russian scholars are quite clear and spokespeople, that this isn't anything to do with really an offensive posture towards the West, that this is about a return of Russia to places and people that are of historic and increasing economic importance to it. And indeed, the Russian narrative would be very much around the expansion of NATO, as you know very well, Brian, right up onto the periphery of Russia, negating what Russia had fought for so hard in the Second World War, and indeed its sacrifices in its high north. And Klaus has written extensively on the historical, political and cultural importance of the Russian Arctic to the very soul of the Russian state. Now, I'd come back to the point I made earlier. Is Russia more dangerous when it is feeling fragile and encroached upon, or when it is feeling buoyant and dynamic? And that, I think, is a hugely ideological point. But you're right. One of the things that has concerned me is the isolation of Russia out of certain institutional organizations, the imposition of sanctions, probably quite rightly after the annexation of Crimea. But what I don't see, which I think the West did really quite brilliantly in the 1980s, is the opening up of various dialogues, if that's at all possible, to bring Russia in rather than shut Russia out. And here, I think science diplomacy has a role to play with Russia. You know, we do cooperate with the Russians in all sorts of manners, and I wonder if there are soft entry points as opposed to hard entry points into a greater cooperation with the Russians. Now, that's very difficult because of, you know, Salisbury, Crimea. It's very difficult for the UK. But I think if containment and the First Cold War and the Second Cold War taught us anything, it is that as well as an offensive military posture, we have to keep those avenues open. And I do think that there is a newer generation, and it's difficult to look beyond Mr. Putin, that will be, I think, more prone to tie itself, if it's possible, to Western states, including the EU, through the Arctic Council, rather than allowing a kind of Sino-Russian access to emerge, which in the long term will do the West absolutely no good at all.
Thank you, Caroline. Does anyone else want to come in on that? We'll move on. No? Okay, so we'll move on to the next question from Aki Tanami.
Oh, hi. Good afternoon. I'm calling in from Japan. So my question is actually about China. Thank you by the way, for fascinating talks by all panels. So I found it interesting that almost all speakers, I think, mentioned China, and there seems to be sort of some imagination that is developing about China from the Arctic or Europe or the UK point of view. So I'm curious about that. Imagine sort of China at the moment as you assess. And this is actually related to the role of science and technology in the Arctic that Ingrid mentioned. And I think, as I understood, science and technology has been also, and particularly cooperation and about science and technology in the Arctic, has been sort of a basis of international collaboration. And then many Arctic states use science as a kind of last resort or window of cooperation when everything else was not. And then it feels, at least in Japan at the moment, we're at the forefront of this kind of a tech war that is emerging between US and China. And then we are under extreme pressure to choose sides. So in that regard, for Japan, China has become sort of it's no longer a kind of a responsible stakeholder to cooperate on scientific front. So from the kind of a Arctic point of view, is China still considered as a stakeholder to that is worth or that is possible to cooperate or otherwise?
Very good question. Thank you, Aki. Would anyone like to begin with an answer? Klaus?
Well, thank you, Aki. I mean, that's a great question. I think, first of all, I would say China's relationship to the Arctic is a complicated one. So there is no one singular relationship. And Caroline's already made very clear that the Chinese-Russian relationship is clearly important. I think I would describe it as strategically opportunistic. It's one that has been accelerated in the last 5 years, in large part because of the impact of sanctions. But in some ways, there's a more interesting story to tell when you look at the smaller Arctic states. So the relationship with Iceland or the relationship with Finland is predicated on slightly different registers. So I think, for example, in Iceland's case, Iceland has actively imagined itself as a kind of gateway state, you know, and through the annual meetings of Arctic Circle meetings that the panelists know well, Iceland gets to sort of present itself as a sort of facilitator. Finland's interesting because Finland's Arctic strategy has been about international competitiveness. How can we monetize Arctic expertise? And as it so happens, there's a market and an opportunity, which is China. And as many of us have been to northern European locations on multiple occasions, we know perfectly well Chinese tourism, for example, until quite recently, was absolutely major player in terms of multiplier effects in places like Tromsø, for example. So the relationship, in other words, is multifaceted. I don't think there's a singular view of the UK, in the UK of China, but I think it's also true to say that we spend probably more time than ever before observing China what it is thinking of doing in the Arctic than ever before.
Any more contributions from the panel to that question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Duncan, that I think one of the interesting things after the financial crisis of 2008 is, of course, that this allows China to emerge in terms of geoeconomics and in terms of the vulnerabilities of certain science, of certain states to the penetration of Chinese capital. And so I think in terms of a new Cold War, if we can use that phrase, that this is really rather different to the old Cold War, in the sense of that we're seeing this new sphere of activity, which is, you know, it's Belt and Road, and it's doing it all in what I would term a wholly non-militarized way. Now, obviously, there are other aspects to this, but until we're aware of the penetration of certain communities and societies, Iceland being, of course, the prime example, I think we're missing an understanding of how China is exerting influence globally, actually.
Thank you, Caroline. So, Ted Griffith, you've been waiting very patiently. If you'd like to come in with your question.
Thank you. I just had to unmute myself. Thank you very much. This has been a fascinating seminar. Thanks very much. I am not an academic. My partners and I are a public affairs firm with interest based in Canada, who have clients that are interested in the North. So your comments about influencing policymakers, that's what we do in our business, and we're actually trying to influence policymakers in Canada and others on Northern issues. So my only advice on influencing policymakers is for you wonderful folks is plain language. Plain, simple language is what gets policymakers' attention. Academic language can scare them away quite quickly. They won't read it. My question is really, though, I would like to get some comments from the panel about the sovereignty issues around the Northwest Passage. Heard a lot of discussion about the Northern Passage and Russia and the Nordic states. But I'd like to get your opinion on the sovereignty issues of the Northwest Passage. Thank you.
Who would like to start?
I think you should, Duncan.
Okay. So I think probably the reason why the Northwest Passage hasn't come up as much is twofold. I think there's probably a fairly broad agreement now that the Arctic is not opening up all in one go, to the extent that term's applicable, but that we see, far more activity, of course, in the high north, the European Arctic, the Russian Arctic, than we do in the North American Arctic, and that's partly just down to the different environmental conditions in the region, the different developmental levels of the regions in terms of infrastructure, in terms of size of population, and so on. Related to that, I don't think, I certainly haven't seen very much from the West, so to speak, looking to challenge I guess what the status quo of agreeing to disagree with Canada potentially over some of the issues with the Northwest Passage. The one exception to that, of course, being some of the statements that came out of the United States at the beginning of last year in relation to freedom of navigation operations. But again, that whole issue seems to it doesn't seem quite as prominent as it did last year in a Canadian context, even though there's still questions being asked about what that means in a Russian context. So I think that's probably where things are with that at the moment. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Can I just make one quick observation, which I think might add further flavour to this important question? I think, first of all, Ted, if we were having this panel in Canada, there's no way we wouldn't have talked about the Northwest Passage by now. So I think, you know, like every discussion of the Arctic, there's always something to be said about where it's held. Here's a thought, though. What could change, given the current difficulties Canada has with China and the United States over the extradition of a certain executive, is this: what happens if China says, we will recognize Canada's sovereignty of the Northwest Passage and will stop messing around like the United States does and insisting upon it as an international strait? Does that change the dynamic of great power politics in the Arctic? Because I could easily see China saying to Canada, you help us out over recognition of certain strategic straits, and we might take a very different public attitude towards your Northwest Passage. I mean, that's the kind of thing that it's not difficult to imagine emerging as a potential point of friction, given that Canada is in a desperately difficult position at the moment. And of course, as we know, China has arrested a number of Canadian citizens on so-called espionage charges. So we can see where this is going.
That brings up the question of China as a reliable partner in the future. Certainly, we've discussed ourselves about. I mean, our only opinion right now is that the Arctic issue is too big for Canada to take on its own. You know, we're a country like Denmark spread out over you know, millions and millions of square miles. So it's perhaps too big for the Canadian government to take on its own, and partnership may be the way to go.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you.
James, I think there's only one James Rogers in the room, so I think you had a question, but if you don't mind, I'll just hold fire on that so that we can give our audience the chance. Good, thank you. So the next person I have on my list is Paula Raboso.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hello. I'm a postgraduate student at King's College London, and I'm currently doing my dissertation on the Arctic strategic aims, Russia's strategic aims in the Arctic. And I have two questions, probably military based. The first one is, through my research, I just realized that, well, Russia is arming itself very disproportionately in the Arctic, as in, I don't know what really Russia is military worried about in the Arctic. Is there any current real threat, or is it deterring any future threats at the same time, even also dominating the area? And my second question is, why would you think NATO has not released any Arctic policy yet? What is it really waiting for?
Thank you, Paula. James, do you want to begin with that?
Yeah, I'll tackle the point about Russia and Russian military buildup. Although I'm very conscious that in the room we have a preeminent Russian historian who knows far more about this than me, with Caroline here. But if you look to history is really important here. You look to how important the Arctic was for Russia during the Cold War, and especially for its nuclear forces. you can see why there was military build-up there to protect that, especially in the age of the Cold War. You know, you look at the, you know, delicately balancing the Cold War actually, and the security concerns that happened there. And you move to today and the recent announcements by the Russian military, the fact that they'll be moving their latest nuclear technologies, 80% of them, including missiles, up to the Arctic. And you can start to see why there has been an increase in the amount of ground-to-air missiles that are placed in the area. So it's not just about the geographical region itself, but it's about what Russia is placing up there. And of course, I've already mentioned about the economic importance of it as well. So for me, I suppose, it's a really good question, but it becomes quite clear why this is important for Russia. I don't know what Caroline thinks.
Caroline, did you want to come in?
Sorry. Hi, thank you for your question, and good luck with the thesis. On the second point, and happy to be in correspondence. On the second point, why hasn't NATO released its Arctic policy? Well, I'm going to come back to Duncan in a minute on that. There is work on a NATO Arctic policy. I think that there are two inhibitors, if I can call it that. And the first is, of course, if we think of NATO as an alliance, there will be some of its members who are more interested in the Arctic than other members. And I think that part of the trick in formulating any policy for NATO is to bring all member states on board with a recognition of what should be prioritized. And I think it's absolutely obvious from a geopolitical point of view that some NATO allies will have far more skin in the game and vested interests in a coherent Arctic policy than others. I'm thinking in particular of the southern NATO members. So I think there's a bureaucratic policy here. I think there's also something very interesting which Duncan has written on. I think NATO Arctic policy has been driven by key but small but stalwart members of NATO like Norway, who see very, very clearly that their best chance of dealing with a resurgent Russia, if we can use that phrase, is to bring the NATO framework in. So I think there's a bureaucratic issue with formulating Arctic strategy within NATO, but I think that has become more urgent because of the urging of northern members, smaller northern members, to say to the NATO alliance that this is absolutely crucial as a theatre. And I would also say that the delay is probably due to COVID-19 and other things taking priority within NATO, but that I do expect to see the announcement and enunciation of an Arctic policy. But I think it has been delayed and held up, but there is absolutely no doubt that certain key member states like Norway, and even those who are friends of NATO, if not in NATO, that this is becoming increasingly imperative because of Russia's actions. I don't know, Duncan, because I know you're heavily involved.
I think all I would really add to that, I mean, I think everything you said was correct there, Caroline. A couple of things that I guess I picked up in my own discussions with NATO. One is that the expectation within NATO still is that if there's to be some sort of coordinated approach to the Arctic, then it should really be led by the NATO Arctic members. And at present, the NATO Arctic members still don't agree on whether NATO should do this. And so until there's kind of a sense, I guess, that until those Arctic states actually agree on what it is that they want NATO to contribute in the Arctic, then for the other for the other NATO members, however sympathetic they are towards that, they're not going to be the ones driving this forward. You know, I know the UK is particularly interested in at least establishing some sort of unified NATO position, but that's more about alliance integrity than it is about a direction of travel. Related to that, NATO will also, I think, if they do put anything out, you will see that they won't talk about the Arctic, they will talk about the High North, specifically because essentially because of the area of responsibility for NATO does not include the North American landmass. So it does not include the entire Arctic. It will be on far more comfortable ground talking about the high north, which, going back to elasticity, it can also stretch to include places like the North Atlantic, and it can also be ambiguous about how far north that actually stretches, which is particularly important in a Russia context because Russia is adamantly opposed to NATO being in the Arctic. And so, you know, in that sense, NATO is kind of damned if it does, damned if it doesn't, because if it does, then it's going to provoke a reaction from Russia. And if it doesn't, then there's going to be various people say, well, why don't you have a strategy towards the region? So I think NATO is actually constantly, as it has been for a long time now, caught in this position of, you know, how do we actually express ourselves in the region without, you know, unnecessarily provoking further tensions, which obviously NATO doesn't want to do. We're coming up to the last 5 minutes of this session now. I have 2 more people on my list at the moment, so I think we'll take those 2 questions together, allow our panelists to respond, and then we'll draw this session to a close. So Pedro Silva, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. So first of all, thank you for the panel. I'm Pedro. I'm from the Catholic University of Rio. And since we are entered in military affairs here, like talking about NATO and so, I would like to know how can we expect, and actually if we can expect, for Arctic governance to hold up against the reality of the prospects of war. Like we've talked about Russia arming itself, about responses from the US. So how can we expect for the governance structure to respond to that?
Okay, thank you, Pedro. Good question. And the other person I had on my list is Yichun Luo. Sorry about the pronunciation.
Yeah, thank you. And my question goes to, as China and the UK, you have mentioned before, there's the Arctic Council's observers. So what way do you think the role they can play in the Arctic governance affairs, or do you think it is necessary for some non-Arctic states to get in the way because, like, they have more focus on the China's intention or something, and think about their why they want to join some Arctic affairs and to get some benefits or something? Because we know that there are more governance things more than the interest stuff you can take, and yeah, so yeah, this is my question.
Thank you. So I think quite fortuitously, two questions there that can be tied together under the heading of Arctic governance. One, how well equipped, I guess, is Arctic governance for responding to tensions in the region and the potential for conflict? And the other, which I took to be about the role, what role is there for non-Arctic states in these governance structures?
I mean, I can just start by saying that the question around Arctic governance and war and how fit it is or fit for purpose, you know, I don't see really much effective Arctic governance when it comes to security concerns. And of course, this is something that you've written about, Duncan. Any forums that were in place have had Russia removed from them since their aggressive moves in Ukraine for obvious reasons, for punishment of breaching the sovereignty of a nation state. So the question then becomes, to what extent do we see the Arctic region and the various Arctic regions as a unique area for perhaps cooperation on security concerns to avoid conflict? And do you then make the decision to bring Russia back into those forums to make them effective once again? That's where the debate is right now. I don't think we've come to an answer for that.
Yes, Ingrid, what role do you see for the non-Arctic states?
Yeah, it's a good question, and like you said, it links to the other one as well. I mean, the Arctic Council very explicitly does not deal with military issues, and that is, of course, also the body where both the UK and China sit as observers. Both the UK and China have a tremendous contribution to make in terms of science and research, and they are already doing that. But I think there are interests there as well that there might be other venues for voicing. And I think what was implied is really interesting, that maybe as non-Arctic states, these countries can raise issues that are difficult for Arctic officials to kind of say explicitly themselves. So maybe there are other routes there. But I think James is right. It's at the moment there are no obvious fora for discussing security issues in this region, and I know there have been attempts in the past, and Russia, of course, is they've also said that they would see kind of explicit NATO involvement in a strategy as an aggressive move. So they've been keen to reinvigorate military collaboration among the Arctic states. I mean, one of the key interests of Russia at the moment is to keep the Arctic as a region governed by those Arctic states. So there's a lot going on there, and I think the question of precisely that, what are the different governance mechanisms, this multilateralism, who has a voice, is maybe where we're gonna see discussion taking place in the coming years.
Ingrid. Klaus, did you have any last thoughts?
I mean, I think one of the ways in which some scholars have tried to tackle this really interesting issue is to use terms like the global Arctic to try and sort of get at what I think we're talking about, is how Arctic governance has become infinitely more complicated. So just to give, two examples, China is involved in Arctic governance and management through its membership of the International Maritime Organization, and the introduction of the Polar Code. So here we are in the UK, in London, at least for me, and we have a UN agency issuing a mandatory code that will deal with all kinds of polar shipping, or at least civilian rather than military. So non-Arctic states can find all kinds of ways to make themselves felt on the Arctic. I think the other big factor is that indigenous peoples, native communities in the Arctic, some of whom are substantial land and resource rights holders, are also globalizing. So you're finding also that these communities are becoming part and parcel of the Arctic, and that's complicating what Arctic governance is, and crucially where it begins and ends.
Thank you, Klaus. And Caroline, a final thought from you?
Sorry, so this is a war studies initiative of BESA, thanks to James and Paddy. So just to end, because nobody can come back at me because Duncan's going to mute us all soon, I cannot imagine what war would look like in the Arctic. I'm just thinking of the distances and thinking of the conditions. I take very seriously James's earlier points about logistics and staging posts and supply chains. But if you think about waging war at -40 degrees, what could it possibly look like? And what I would end with is, an optimistic note. I think deterrence is still a really useful concept in the Arctic, but the Russians won't want war because they don't need to go to war, because they have a panoply of other ways of influencing Arctic behaviors. And I think if we look at, Crimea, if we look at the threat from the Baltic states, it's going to be everything short of war. And that's the danger. It's going to be hybrid, and it's going to be about the people, and it's going to be about the structures, and there will be contestation about governance and sovereignty. So I think that that's far more likely.
Thank you, Caroline. A very good point there to end on, I think. So we've come to the end of our time. We've overrun slightly. Apologies for that. I think all that really remains to be said is to thank our panelists for their fantastic contributions today, to thank all of you for joining us today, especially those of you who have contributed to the discussion. Thank you, Patrick and James, for the support of the BESA War Studies Working Group. And thank you, Dee Pettifer and Chrissy Duxon from BESA for helping us to organise the event. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue with you over email, and hopefully getting to meet you all in person at some stage in the near future. So have a very good afternoon.